Good evening. My name is Grayson Orisini, and I will be your moderator for tonight's discussion. The United States has the highest incarceration rate of any nation on the planet. This is the result of a number of policies aimed at combating a perceived crime wave that lasted from the 1960s to the 1990s. With crime rates falling, many people, like Larry Krasner, are aiming to reform the criminal justice system from within in order to make it more just and equitable for those involved. Recent events, both in the country and here in Hampton Roads, makes tonight's conversation especially important. Joining me tonight is Dr. Idonia K. Barrett, Mr. David Holt, and Professor Austin W. Ashe. Dr. Barrett is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Sciences at Hampton University, teaching courses in criminal justice and sociology. She's interested in advancing the social conditions of the underserved and wanting to diminish the disparities of the injustices that occur within the criminal justice system. She has received recognition as favorite professor for the 2013-2014 academic year by the Student Support Services and nominated as Female Faculty Member of the Year from HBCU Digest for 2016. Recently, she has been accepted into the Norfolk Field Office for the FBI Citizens Academy for the spring 2021 class. Dr. Barrett received her PhD in Human Services with a concentration in criminal justice from Walden University. In addition, she received her Master's of Arts in Criminal Justice with a specialization in criminal law and procedure from the John Jay School of Criminal Justice in New York. Her research interests are focused on the relationship between the community and the police, the impact of incarceration on the family, and officer reintegration. Mr. David Holt is a lawyer at the Smith Law Center. He was born and raised in Newport News, Virginia. He has earned his undergraduate degree in business administration from the University of Mary Washington and received his Juris Doctor degree from Regent University School of Law in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Before law school, Mr. Holt served as a police officer in Hampton, working closely with the training division, where he developed protocols and training materials for police recruits. In October 2003, Mr. Holt was admitted into the Virginia Bar and began to work for then State Senator Ken Stolley for the 8th Senatorial District in Virginia Beach, where he discovered his passion for and gained valuable experience in civil and criminal law. He began his trial career in Hampton as a state prosecutor, litigating hundreds of jury trials. Mr. Holt has experience in lecturing to other prosecutors and law enforcement agencies around the state concerning the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments. Holt is admitted in the Virginia State Bar, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern and Western Districts of Virginia, and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 4th Circuit. Last but not least, we have Professor Austin Ashe, who's an assistant professor at Norfolk State University in the Department of Sociology. He earned his PhD in sociology from Duke University in 2017 with a focus on race theory and criminal justice. His expertise is broad, having taught courses in social statistics, methodology, policing, theory, and policy, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. Dr. Ashe's research has examined policing, representative bureaucracy, colorblind racism in the media, and racial socialization. His professional experience includes developing youth programs for teenagers living in New York City public housing. So I wanted to start the first question in the audience. You know, after seeing this film, you realize that Mr. Krasner's campaign was focusing on reforming the entire criminal justice system, ranging from bail reform to improving prison conditions. And I would be interested in hearing from each of you in your takes on whether he is correct. Does the entire system need reform? Or if maybe with our city's more limited resources, more pressing issues of the criminal justice system need reform first and need to be prioritized. What do you guys think about that idea? I'll start with you, Dr. Ashe, if you could start us off, please.
Sure. So, I mean, this is the difficult question, right? In terms of how much you can get done. And I think, you know, on one hand, I think we have to kind of applaud what Krasner is attempting to do in terms of creating change in a short or limited amount of time, right? And we see that happening. We see him kind of trying to push the button and avoid kind of these bureaucratic delays, right, in the process. You form a committee and before you know it, you can't get anything done, right? But I would argue that indeed we need more, right? And so one of the things that a public defender once told me in an interview was that her job felt like she was pulling baby a baby out of a river, right? Or babies out of a river. And for each baby she pulled, she lost a dozen, right? And so I think that a part of it is that, obviously there's a benefit to kind of any of these reforms in terms of like at the local level. If you can help one person get out of jail, that's meaningful. And so in Krasner's case, if he can help a lot of people avoid or get out of jail, then that's wonderful. But I still think it avoids kind of the larger or broader issue, which is babies in the river in the first place, right? And so I think a lot of times reform is a wrench when we need a wrecking ball. And I'm not sure that even in Krasner's case, that just one individual prosecutor is a wrecking ball.
Okay. Dr. Barrett, what do you think?
I can see that, but at one respect, it didn't happen overnight. And as Dr. Ashe mentioned, he's having to work in a small window. So bail, changing bail, especially the charges as we see in the episode where he seeks to increase possession so is not stopping individuals for these minimal ounces or simple possession as it would be recognized. And he can only do but so much. And I understand he's coming up for re-election soon. And that is going to be the one to watch. But systematically, he's in a position for which he can make these decisions. Now, whether or not his team is to follow, as we start to see some of that from those who stay within the DA's office, it's hard to see if he's going to have that support, especially though the city has essentially radicalized behind him because they want to see a change. At this point, I think they're fatigued. So they're like, why not? Let's try something different. Definitely systemic. This is just one branch of the system. And though they are to work together, the courts with the prosecution, with policing, which people often forget, police officers are considered, I was taught they were considered more like the gatekeepers to the criminal justice system. They too have a high level of discretion. And what's also happening between his office and the police force is this lack of mistrust because of his history of being a defense attorney and oftentimes suing police officers and outwardly stating that the DA's office has been essentially in cahoots with police officer behavior and misconduct. So in one respect, he is, I don't see the wrecking ball, but I do see a radical change, and change is uncomfortable. And it would be amazing if he is reelected, because then I think he would be able to continue on with that change. But he is definitely on the clock these past few years, and it would be something to see in hopes that he does get reelected to further that change, because I think it would be necessary for people to understand it's going to take time for something that has been going on for decades to change within one term. So he has a lot of pressure on his back for sure.
Okay. Mr. Holt, what do you think?
I think he's got a lot of work to do. Of course, this film is about his election several years ago. I just looked up the number of police officers in Philadelphia, and there are roughly 6,300 police officers in Philadelphia. That's a lot. In Hampton, I had about 180, I think, maybe as many as 220 at any given time. Virginia Beach is somewhere around 600 or 700. Norfolk is probably somewhere around 500. So when you're talking about a wrecking ball and attempting to try to reform the justice system internally, such that he's going to have to start with the police department, because as Dr. Barrett just indicated, they're the boots on the ground. They're the gateway to the justice system. I was there. I was on the streets seeing it, and you're right. The police officers have an extraordinary amount of discretion, and so do the prosecutors. What he was trying to do with bail reform, I think you're seeing that all over the country right now. And whether he precipitated it back several years ago when he first started talking about this, or it was already a wave that was making its way across the country, it's not new. I know that there are several progressive-minded district attorneys, or we call them Commonwealth attorneys here in Virginia, who are friends of mine, and who agree with that and think that bail reform is not only, it's an important part of reforming the criminal justice system, so you're not keeping people in jail who don't deserve to be in jail until their court dates. and you're seeing that movement make its way across the country, and really specifically locally here in Virginia. Greg Underwood, I'm certain, is moving towards that as well in Norfolk. I know Anton Bell is part of that. He's the prosecutor in Hampton. I've got a very good friend of mine up in Alexandria who's doing the same thing. This, whether you want to call it progressive or whether you want to call it reform, either way, he's got an uphill battle. He must coexist with the police department. I can tell you that a poor relationship with the police department at the DA level is going to bode very unfortunate results in the courtroom and in front of judges. But one other aspect, there are two other aspects I think that we have to focus on here, and I think that I haven't seen whether or not he's gone to this extent. It's the General Assembly here in Virginia, or it's wherever it is in Philadelphia, reforming the laws that the judges have to follow. And just as importantly, you're talking about the executive branch when you're dealing with the DAs, and then you also have the police department where you have to, hit it from the streets. So I think he's got an uphill battle, but it's a really good story so far.
Yeah, I mean, so often what you see is a disconnect between state legislatures and the major cities, and kind of their viewpoints clash. But actually, you touched on, Mr. Holt, a kind of a trend, or at least a growing number of progressive or reform-minded DAs. I want to pose this question first to Dr. Barrett. I mean, do you see Krasner's rise to Philly DA as part of a national trend, or do you think his election and the election of others is kind of more based on the circumstances and times that we live in? And I mean, like specifically, the fall of the crime rate that I'm mentioning, or the perceived crime rate, the Black Lives Matter movement, or just kind of the zeitgeist that we're living in.
I think it is a trend. And I think everybody's going to look more to Philadelphia because it's a larger city, and you're dealing with technically a more diverse population of individuals. And so he's not only having to show Philadelphia what he can do, he's also essentially, maybe not purposely, but being that beacon for any other kind of large office across this nation, because there is that misconception that crime is prevalent and it could happen at any moment. That is a scare tactic that is more often used during election cycles. Part of people's platform, either lock them up, we'll keep you safe, think about your mother and your grandparents. Of course, we want to protect our family, but we have to be realistic at the same time. And so in showing what he can do by restructuring his office, I think it would give hope to others of same size, because then my next question would be that of New York City, which too in part has the largest police force in this nation. And so as Mr. Holt made mention about having that relationship with the district attorney's office and the police is definitely that much more important. And so it is a hope in that other offices across this nation get in touch with that, because even when we go about the change, we're not saying that we let everybody walk free, but there's also the opportunity for the office to be more preventative, having more diversion programs, giving second chances, especially for juvenile offenders, first-time offenders. And so repeat offenders only become that way because of lack of resources. So monies too need to be shifted to help these individuals to not reoffend. Because more often than not, there are for quality of life offenses. They're stealing because they're hungry, or they're trying to account for something that's missing in their homes, not just out of the simple joy of opportunity. And that's another misconception. So with this lens, this literal lens that his office is having, my hope is that every other office is looking to make that change. But it's also going to be used as a political tool that has been prevalent in many election cycles at any level of government, as into either keep your family safe or you're going to help us make a difference. And we need to know that they can work together and not just be on opposite sides of the spectrum.
Dr. Ashe, what do you think?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, they even mentioned in the episode, right, that this is a small group compared to the 2,500 or so prosecutors nationwide, right? And I think that, I mean, honestly, the fact that this is the focus of a series kind of points to the fact that, like, this is a compelling surprise and it's not the norm, right? Which is why, people are gravitating towards it. I also think a part of it is the fact that, he's a white man as well, which is something that was also mentioned in the documentary itself. And I think that that plays a role into why there's so much attention on him. But as far as like whether or not we see this as a trend, again, I think, it's difficult to say. Part of what's concerning to me is that what makes him capable of doing what he is doing is also what allowed former prosecutors to contribute to the growth of mass incarceration, which is this incredible amount of discretion that they have, right? And so the question becomes, is it about just kind of getting more Krasners into those positions, or should the way that we conceive of public safety as a whole change and prosecutors just not have the power that they have over people's lives?
Mr. Holt, as a former Commonwealth's attorney yourself, what's your take on that?
I think 100%. It's a nationwide movement. I look at the makeup that you see up in Richmond and the makeup that you see in Washington in terms of the political spectrum. You're going to find, I mean, I believe that Ralph Northam here in Virginia just allowed the legalization of a small amount of marijuana, possession of marijuana. That is an enormous step towards reforming our criminal justice system. I can tell you as a police officer, one of the first things I learned in training camp, or when I went to the police academy, not one of the first, but when it came to drugs, was smelling weed, smelling pot. And you knew how to smell it when it was burned, and they taught you how to smell it when it was fresh. And it is a distinct odor. And I can tell you that is used on umpteen times to establish probable cause to pull individuals over. And so merely allowing and legalizing a small amount of marijuana and even some ounces of marijuana is an enormous step. And I think the General Assembly just this past year is a new creature. And it's going to be reflective, I believe, of, I mean, look, Virginia for years was a red state, and it's now blue. And I think that as that blueness heads its way down south, you're going to find more of these general assemblies and legislatures who are doing the same thing. And the people have spoken. You see who's been elected in Washington, and we understand the pulls and pushes of politics. But it's got to start at the legislative level and at the district attorney's level and the Commonwealth attorney's level. And Dr. Barrett's 100% correct. The discretion that is afforded these district attorneys, it's enormous. And we have meetings about charging decisions on certain cases, and we have meetings with the police department over charges with respect to murder, how it is that we're going to investigate the murder, how it is that we're going to eventually prosecute the murder. As a former prosecutor and as a former police officer, I hope we see it. I think it's needed. I think it's 100% needed.
I mean, you bring up a good point, and I think that's honestly been a common thread, I think, through this discussion so far, is the need to not only focus on changing the laws, changing what the legislature is passing, changing the culture of the DA, but also changing the culture of police. And like everyone has said, it starts with the police, with boots on the ground. And that part was alluded to in the film, and the film really touched on the culture of policing as kind of being a major impediment to Mr. Krasner's mission. And I'm actually going to ask this question to you first, Mr. Holt, because you're the cop in the group. Do you believe this is true? Do you believe the culture of policing is a major impediment to changing the criminal justice system? And if so, what specific aspects of police culture do you think need changing in the United States?
I think it was. I think it's trending towards a different way of policing. Even as I was a police officer, let me give you an example. As I was a police officer, we went from carrying batons to retractable asps. And all that means is that I'm not carrying on a billy club, because that's what they used to call them. And they're called now retractable asps. Now they can do just as much damage, but you don't see them. We just instituted, when I was going through the academy and just after the academy, pepper spray. And that was a different way of marginalizing the use of force. So it was one step between putting your hands on somebody versus taking your weapon out and pulling your weapon out and threatening somebody. You actually had another way of softening the contact. It's even further. You're seeing rubber bullets. You're seeing that the departments are attempting to try to use their force. I'm saying your internet connection is unstable. I hope you still see me. That the use of force continuum is changing. Do I believe it's an impediment? I think the police department is going to have to be nudged that way. All police departments are going to have to be nudged that way. You're going to find probably more people, more police officers who are going to be afraid to walk the streets, which is really unfortunate. I still have police officers out there who are who have told me they are afraid to get out of their cars, not because of the trouble that they're going to find or their threat of injury or harm, but they don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to do something that's now going to be on film and on a camera where they say something wrong in a split second and their career goes down the tube. That's troublesome. And if you want community policing, you need those people on the streets that are going to get out of their cars and say hello to Mr. Smith on the corner, because Mr. Smith is seeing everything that's going on at that drug location or at that old telephone pole or at that old telephone booth where they're selling drugs. And I saw it all the time. And if you're not getting out of the cars, you're not talking to the community leaders. And I can't stress how important that is. Having that relationship between the community and the police department, and there's nothing else better if you can bridge that relationship. Do I think it's an impediment? I think it's going to be. Do I think Mr. Krasner had an uphill battle when he got elected? Unquestionably. And I'd be curious to see his statistics right now after some of these reforms and his position on some of the initial positions that he took when he was elected, to see what he's taking now, those same positions, and whether he can afford to take those same positions, and whether crime rates have gone up. I just looked where Philadelphia had in 2020 the highest murder rate it's ever had.
Dr. Barrett, what are your thoughts?
The police subculture, yes, it's definitely an impediment. But what's happening is because I understand officers don't want to feel like they're being attacked, whether physically or even about their abilities within their position. But at one respect, they're going to have to remember you signed on to be for the community. But the other issue that comes around is that when you're going into communities that already have generational mistrust, and now there is the talk more of a national dialogue about the need for the change. Community-oriented policing is not a newer concept. It just gets re-energized and reinforced to say, let's go this route, which it is a great idea, but whether or not you can change the minds of the community, it can happen, but it's going to take some time. For so long, there has been the mistrust. You've given no reason for the people to say, okay, I'm gonna give you this chance. And currently right now we're dealing with the Derek Chauvin trial with the death of George Floyd. And I'm not excited for the trial, but what I am pleased to see is that it is live and being streamed. So the public is getting the information at the same time, and we're not necessarily getting the media spin. As helpful as media are, there are concerns sometimes of what they pick and choose to share. So I appreciate the courts being open in that regards. But going back to the police subculture in terms of the training, but even more so providing officers resources, or rather not using them as the first line of defense in most situations, especially if a person is having a mental health episode, or a person is just having a moment of stress, where resources could be better allocated. Having mental health professionals there, having someone talk down to de-escalate. And unfortunately, that has not been what has been taught in the academies. But it's not because the officers don't want these skills. It's just that for so long, they're just taught to, if necessary, a danger, once they assess it, please don't let me put words into your mouth to the officer who's here on the panel, please correct me. But once the training is also placed into the academy to have, along with life preserving of themselves and those who they respond to, there also needs to be a training on part of the community to know what is happening. So transparency is going to be a big factor, instead of having this, what is referred to as this blue veil that has happened for so long between the community and the police.
If you don't mind me just jumping in here real fast, I will tell you that officers are unquestionably trained to deal with mental health issues and declining mental health issues in emergent situations. Let me back up a little bit and explain to you that the personalities of the people who become police officers, they are type A. And a majority of these individuals who are hired as police officers, at least in this area, are former military. So you're combining type A personalities who want to have power, or who want to be on top of things and be in charge. And you're combining that with some military experience. Some of that mental health training that you're trained at the academy 4, 5, 6, 8 years ago, while you're out there on the street, gets thrown out the window when you're trying to deal with somebody who you don't really quite understand whether they're having a mental health breakdown, or whether they're high, or whether they're on meth and they've got a knife in their hand. What do you do? And so the training is there. The training needs to be better. The training needs to be more consistent. And frankly, bringing mental health individuals and spending the resources to do that, I think, is a great idea. But you got to make sure they're protected. And when they go to these scenes that are, because I've seen them blow up. I've seen mental health situations completely tank. And if you don't have a police officer there to provide safety for those situations, it can get really out of hand.
Okay. Dr. Ashe, especially with your background, I'd really like to hear your take on this issue.
Sure. So I would argue that the problem is actually bigger than police subculture, and it's police in itself, right? And I say that in part as somebody who grew up in New York City housing projects, subject to police brutality and stop and frisk. I say that also as a son of a police officer who spent 20 years and also ended up losing his life as a result of sickness that he got as a first responder on September 11th. And I saw what it meant to be a Black police officer, and how it is that it impacted him and then us as his family, right? And so what I would argue is that, in fact, we don't need policing as it currently exists. And that instead, I think that we are creative enough to come up with an alternative way to address public safety and harm, right? And so what I would argue also is that some of that fear that police officers have is racialized and unjustified. And then also, as it relates to the crime rate in Philadelphia, we have to be careful to remember that correlation doesn't mean causation, right? And that a part of why we might see that increase in crime has to do with the pandemic and has to do with, other variables, not just simply some of the policy decisions made by Krasner. So I think we really need to rethink just how we address public safety.
And on that note, we have time for one final question, and that is, moving forward, what do you propose, or how do you propose that we better integrate the community's needs with the criminal justice system? So how do we better promote community policing? How do we make sure that the DA is being just in who they're pursuing and prosecuting? How do we ensure that judges, are sentencing fair sentences? So, Dr. Ashe, I'm actually going to start with you, since we started with you. We will finish with you first. So, go ahead.
So I guess having a more radical perspective also means that I don't think it's about building trust, right, in an unjust system, and that instead, again, we don't necessarily need policing as it exists, nor do we need prisons or jails the way that they currently exist. And so that even this focused on rebuilding trust, I think is focused on the wrong thing. And I think Krasner would agree that even his election is part of this national movement that was really rooted in the lived experience of Black people in this country who are resisting cumulative injustice, right, over generations. And so I don't think it's really about rebuilding trust in an unjust system. but instead and kind of recreating, again, another way to deal with public safety.
Okay. Mr. Holt, what do you think?
I think I've written down three things: transparency, media, and resources. I think the media is extraordinarily important to bring a spotlight to everything that goes on around in our criminal justice system, because many people aren't aware of how things kind of operate procedurally through the criminal justice system. I think it's very important to have transparency from the jump. Having the Axon cameras. I do some defense attorney work now, and having that is, I can't tell you how important it is for me to be able to review those things, because I'm getting one side of the story from my client and another side of the story from the police and what's written in the police report. Those cameras are extraordinarily important, and you're seeing that in the Chauvin trial, as Dr. Barrett just indicated. And so that's part of the transparency. I think more of these types of trials, whether it's a trial of a police officer in Chicago, or whether it's a trial of a drug dealer or a murderer in Philadelphia, I think the general public needs to understand how they work. And then I think the general public needs to understand exactly how the judges make these decisions. For instance, there was just a big movement in Virginia, and this is one way of a big reform, where judges now have the ability to be able to sentence, and it's taken out of the jury's hands. That's in the federal system, in the criminal justice system, in the federal system, is that the jury determines guilt or innocence, or guilt or not guilty, and the judge sentences based upon a very complicated formula. Okay, that has been now changed in Virginia, and that is a huge step forward in the criminal justice reform system, because it's taken a lot of the indiscretion, the non-discretionary decisions that judges had, rubber stamping a jury trial's decision and sending people away for life. A judge now can listen to the stories of the family, can listen to the stories of individuals like Dr. Ashe, or people who think like him, who say, we've got to change this system and it's got to be better for our community. So I think those three ways to be able to have that transparency, the media, and the resources are three most key points in order to be able to move forward, like Mr. Krasner is doing up there in Philadelphia.
Last but not least, Dr. Barrett, what do you think about how do we better integrate the community with the criminal justice system?
Oh, it's a loaded question because I see both sides from Dr. Ashe and Mr. Holt. You know, at one regards, especially how it's going currently. Granted, we are seeing the places and spots and the people who are seeking change, getting into the positions to make change, and then also there is the need for transparency. And honestly, I believe all of it needs to be a part of the equation, because in one respect, we need to learn what it is doing, how it is functioning, so that we can better assess it and to either throw it out the window and start over. But I definitely do recognize in one respect that we do have communities that are over policed. We do have communities where the police force has been militarized in their responses, even in instances, of the protests that have been going on. And then we also have it so that people whose family go through the system as either a victim or as a suspect. And so when there has been this continual, and essentially when the system has not been created or accounting for people of color, you know, we've never seen ourselves be counted essentially within the changes. And so granted, there are moves in that direction. And the hope is that it will change overall immensely and swiftly. It could be quite some time, but what I do often tell, at least my students too, because they become fatigued once we go through many of the cases and such, and it's like, well, if there's no way out, what can we do really to stay present, stay on it, and if possible, get within the system some way so that you can make the changes, whether it's to get rid of the system or to fix it from the inside. And honestly, that's what I see Krasner doing as his intention. You know, instead of just being on the outside, now let me be on the inside to make those changes. And again, my hope is that He is successful in many places, and I would be interested in seeing how his policies have made, or his changes to the policies have made to the public. And I think that'll come out more so in this year or so because of his upcoming election.
Thank you, Dr. Barrett. And thank you, Dr. Ashe and Mr. Holt. This was a great discussion, and we have barely scratched the surface about all these issues. And if I could just say one thing to the audience, everyone on this panel is involved in some way with criminal justice, whether we've represented clients or we've been a cop or we've studied the pressing issues at hand. And I hope the audience has learned some of the issues and is able to act. I think there's lots of aspects of the criminal justice system that we haven't even touched on, and I hope you guys go out and explore and find things that bother you, and hopefully you guys are able to act on it. So thank you. I hope you guys enjoyed the film, and I hope you guys enjoyed our discussion, and thanks again to our panelists.
Thank you, Grayson.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Doctor.
We want to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and a special thank you to our panelists, Dr. Austin Ashe, Dr. Idonia Barrett, and Mr. David Holt, and moderator Grayson Orisini. We're grateful for you and your time and your insights for being a part of this important conversation. Philly DA and other Independent Lens films can be seen on WHRO. Independent Lens and other popular PBS programs are also available anytime at home or on the go on Passport for WHRO members. For more information on Passport, WHRO Public Media, or the Emerging Leaders Board, go to WHRO.org. May 20th will be our next Independent Lens pop-up with Donut King, the story of a Cambodian refugee who escaped genocide and overcame poverty to build a life for himself and hundreds of other immigrant families. We hope to see you there. To register, go to WHRO.org/events. Stay healthy, and we hope to see you all very soon.